What happens when a Hollywood legend like Clint Eastwood meets a man at his lowest point? One simple question, one life-changing moment. Can a single act of kindness really turn someone's life around? Watch as Clint Eastwood offers much more than just $1 and see how it changes everything. Like, subscribe, and join us for more inspiring stories. It was a mild afternoon in Los Angeles. A typical sunny day where the warmth of the sun met the cool breeze in a perfect balance. Outside a quiet cafe on Melrose Avenue, life moved in its usual pace. The tables were scattered with people enjoying their coffee, but one particular person stood out among them. He sat alone, wearing sunglasses that partially shielded his face. His presence was unmistakable. Clint Eastwood, the legendary Hollywood actor whose fame transcended generations. Though time had softened the sharpness of his features, his aura remained undeniable. Passers-by couldn't help but glance his way, unsure whether they should interrupt the icon's moment of solitude. Clint sat in silence, seemingly lost in his own world, as the hum of the street life went on around him. He was used to this kind of attention, but today, something else was happening across the street. A man stood across the road, his clothes layered and worn, telling a story of days spent on the streets. His hair was disheveled, and his eyes darted nervously, scanning the cafe for someone he could approach. In his hand, he clutched a small cardboard sign, the words barely visible. This man was Kevin. It had been 3 weeks since Kevin had found himself sleeping behind a dumpster near a convenience store. He hadn't had a full meal in 2 days. His stomach ached from hunger, gnawing at him like a relentless reminder of how far he had fallen. The desperation was clear in his eyes. He needed help, but what could a man like Clint Eastwood possibly offer a person like him? As Kevin stood there, an internal battle raged within him. He hesitated for a moment, unsure, vulnerable. But then hunger, pride, and shame collided. He crossed the street, each step feeling heavier than the last. His voice trembled as he approached Clint's table, barely audible. "Sir, can you spare $1?" Clint slowly removed his sunglasses and looked up. His expression was unreadable, and for a moment, Kevin wondered if he had made a mistake. But then Clint leaned back in his chair, studying Kevin intently. The silence stretched on, and Kevin's anxiety began to grow. Just as he was about to apologize and leave, Clint spoke up. $1, huh?" Clint's voice was neutral, and then, with a hint of a smile, he added, "Sit down. Let's talk." Kevin froze. The invitation felt surreal. Was this some sort of cruel joke? But the calmness in Clint's eyes reassured him, and with a quiet, "Thank you," Kevin sat down across from him. The weight of Clint's gaze wasn't judgmental. It was curious, as if Clint truly wanted to understand the man in front of him. Kevin sat there, hands trembling slightly, trying to steady his breath. As he placed the cardboard sign on the table, he angled it carefully, hoping it wouldn't draw too much attention. He could feel Clint's gaze on him, but it wasn't the look of a stranger judging him. There was no contempt, no pity, just a deep curiosity that made Kevin feel both exposed and strangely comforted. "I'm sorry if I bothered you," Kevin stammered, his voice raw. "I don't usually ask. I've been trying to find work, but it's harder than I thought." He glanced down at his hands, ashamed of how desperate he sounded. Clint didn't interrupt. He just listened. That, more than anything, was what stood out to Kevin. Most people ignored him or threw him some loose change, never bothering to listen. But Clint was different. He didn't dismiss him, didn't judge him. He simply listened, like he truly cared. Kevin took a deep breath and continued. "I used to be a contractor. Had a crew, steady work. But then the recession hit, and the jobs dried up. It didn't take long for the savings to run out. Then came the late notices and—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Well, you can guess the rest." A bitter, hollow laugh escaped his lips. "Funny, right? I spent my whole life building other people's homes, and now I can't even keep a roof over my own head." Clint's face remained calm, but his eyes softened. Kevin felt the shame creeping in again, and instinctively tried to steer the conversation away from himself. "I know you probably get asked for things all the time. I don't mean to be another guy with his hand out. I don't know what else to do anymore." But Clint wasn't the type to brush off a story like that. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, clasping his hands loosely. The air between them seemed to grow heavier, quieter, as if the world had slowed down just for this moment. Kevin could feel his pulse quicken. He half expected Clint to hand him a couple of bucks and send him on his way, just like everyone else had done before. But instead, Clint asked a question Kevin wasn't prepared for. "What's your name?" Kevin blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. Kevin," he muttered, barely above a whisper. Clint nodded slowly, repeating the name to himself, as if testing how it sounded. After a brief pause, Clint said, "You know, Kevin, I've played a lot of characters in my life. Cowboys, soldiers, detectives. And one thing I've learned is that every one of them had a story. Good, bad, ugly. It didn't matter. What mattered was how they chose to carry it." Kevin stared at Clint, unsure of where this was going. Then Clint continued, "So tell me this, Kevin. What's the next chapter of your story?" Kevin was taken aback. The next chapter? What did Clint mean? He blinked, his mind scrambling to grasp the meaning behind the question. "The next chapter?" he echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Yeah," Clint said, leaning back in his chair. "You're still here, aren't you? Breathing, talking, asking for $1. That means your story isn't over yet. So, what's the next chapter?" Kevin's heart sank. He didn't have an answer. The truth was, he hadn't thought that far ahead in a long time. Survival had taken up every ounce of his energy. He couldn't remember the last time he'd thought about a future beyond getting through the day. "I don't know," Kevin admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I just want to make it through the day." Clint's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in thought. "That's not a chapter, Kevin. That's a sentence. You need a chapter, a real one, something you can build on." Kevin felt a strange mix of frustration and curiosity. Was Clint really asking him to plan a future? To think beyond just surviving? He wanted to ask Clint what he knew about struggle, but something in Clint's tone made him hold back. Clint reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. Kevin's heart sank. This was it. Clint was going to give him a few bucks and send him on his way. But to Kevin's surprise, Clint didn't pull out cash. Instead, he pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. "Go here," Clint said firmly, but not unkindly. "It's a shelter run by a buddy of mine. They'll help you get cleaned up, find a job, maybe even a place to stay. But it's up to you to take the first step." Kevin stared at the card, his hands trembling. "Why? Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice cracking. Clint's expression softened just a fraction. "Because someone did it for me once," he said quietly. "And I wouldn't be sitting here if they hadn't." But Kevin wasn't sure if he could trust this offer. Could he really take that step? Could he believe that someone truly cared? "I don't know, man," Kevin said after a long silence, shaking his head. "I've tried places like that before. They don't really help people like me." Clint's gaze didn't waver. "People like you? What does that even mean?" Kevin swallowed hard, avoiding Clint's gaze. "You wouldn't get it. Guys like me, we're just forgotten." Clint leaned forward again, his voice quiet but firm. "You think I've never been down? You think I don't know what it's like to feel like you're carrying the weight of the world, and no one's there to help you lift it?" Kevin looked up, startled. Clint's calm face carried a weight in his words. "I grew up dirt poor during the Depression," Clint continued. "I know what it's like to go to bed hungry, wondering if tomorrow's going to be any better. And let me tell you something, Kevin. It's not about how hard you fall. It's about whether you're willing to get back up, even when the odds are stacked against you. The words hit Kevin harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to argue, but found he had nothing to say. Clint leaned back in his chair, his tone softening. "Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I have all the answers. But what I do know is this: life isn't fair, and it never will be. The only thing you can do is decide whether you're going to let that break you or build you." Kevin felt tears welling in his eyes, but quickly blinked them away. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice cracking. "No, it's not," Clint agreed. "But simple doesn't mean easy. It's hard as hell. But if you don't try, you'll never know what could have been." Kevin stared at the card again, his mind racing. Could he really do it? Could he really change his life? For the first time in years, Kevin felt a spark of something he hadn't dared to hold on to before. Hope, maybe. Or maybe it was just the realization that he had nothing left to lose. "I'll think about it," Kevin said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint nodded. "Good. That's all I'm asking." Kevin left the cafe, the business card still clenched tightly in his hand. He walked aimlessly through the streets, lost in thought. As he passed shop windows, he saw his reflection, tired, worn, and defeated. But for the first time in a long while, there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him pause and reconsider everything he thought he knew about his own life. Could he really take the next step? Could he dare to believe that someone like Clint Eastwood, someone who had lived a lifetime of success and hardship, cared enough to give him a chance? His legs carried him further, his mind swirling with questions and possibilities. What was he waiting for? Was he afraid of failing again? Or was he simply scared of the unknown, of a future that could potentially be better, but also one where he had no guarantees? As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden light over the city, Kevin's thoughts turned back to Clint's words. It's not about how hard you fall. It's about whether you're willing to get back up. The weight of those words pressed against his chest, but in a way that was strangely comforting. For the first time, Kevin began to believe that getting back up didn't necessarily mean facing an uphill battle alone. It meant taking the help that was offered, taking the first step toward something better. The following morning, Kevin woke up early. The cold air bit at his skin as he stepped out from behind the dumpster, the familiar sounds of the city ringing in his ears. His clothes, still ragged and torn, clung to his body, but he didn't mind. It was another day, another chance. His hands shook as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled business card Clint had given him. He studied the number and the address, his breath coming in short, shaky bursts. This was it. This was the moment he had to make a decision. The shelter Clint had mentioned wasn't far away, but it felt like an entire world away from the streets Kevin had known for so long. With each step toward the shelter, Kevin's heart beat faster. He was unsure of what would happen when he arrived, whether the place would offer him a warm meal or simply another dead end. But he knew that if he didn't try, he would remain stuck in the same endless cycle of fear and hopelessness. As he reached the shelter, a feeling of uncertainty filled his chest. He stood outside for a long moment, taking in the sight of the worn building, wondering if he would be accepted, if he would be turned away. He didn't know what to expect, but Clint had believed in him, and that belief felt like the tiniest lifeline, one he was afraid to let go of. Finally, with a deep breath, Kevin pushed open the door. Inside, the warmth of the building hit him almost immediately. It wasn't much, just a small room with a few chairs and a handful of people sitting around. But to Kevin, it felt like an entirely new world. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and food, and the sound of soft murmurs filled the space. A woman behind the counter looked up when he entered, her expression neutral, though not unkind. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm. Kevin hesitated. but only for a moment. The words came out before he could stop them. I'm here because of Clint Eastwood. He said I could come here." The woman's eyes softened, and she nodded. "You must be Kevin. We've been expecting you. Come on in." She led him to a seat and handed him a warm blanket and a cup of tea. Kevin felt a surge of gratitude, but also a deep sense of disbelief. After all this time, after so many failed attempts at finding stability, someone had finally taken a chance on him. Clint Eastwood had shown him that sometimes the hardest part of change wasn't doing it alone. It was allowing others to help you along the way. Over the next few weeks, Kevin began to rebuild. He stayed at the shelter, cleaned himself up, and started looking for work. At first, it was slow. He wasn't used to the routine, to the structure of a life that didn't involve survival at every turn. But with each day, he gained confidence. And with each day, he also began to see the power of hope, the kind that Clint had reminded him of. It wasn't a smooth journey. There were days when Kevin felt the weight of his past pressing down on him. He wondered if he was good enough for a second chance. But every time that doubt crept in, he remembered Clint's words, and he pushed forward. Months passed, and Kevin's life gradually began to change. He found a job working at a local construction site. Nothing glamorous, but it was work. It was honest. It was a way out of the cycle he had been trapped in for so long. He saved up enough money to rent a small apartment, a place that was his and his alone. He wasn't rich, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had something to stand on. One afternoon, as Kevin walked to the corner store, he saw an old newspaper in the trash with Clint Eastwood's face on the cover. He paused for a moment, staring at the headline, "Hollywood Legend, Clint Eastwood Announces New Film." He smiled to himself, then reached down and grabbed the paper, holding it in his hands for a moment longer. Clint's impact on his life couldn't be measured by mere dollars or fleeting moments. It was something deeper, a shift in perspective that had saved him from the depths of despair. Clint had shown him that the difference between falling and getting back up wasn't a matter of chance. It was a choice. And because of that, Kevin had chosen to rise. Kevin didn't reach out to Clint again. He didn't have to. Clint's lesson was something he carried with him every day, something that didn't need acknowledgement. But on the anniversary of the day he had met Clint, Kevin did something he never thought he would do. He volunteered at the shelter that had given him a second chance. He knew that helping others wasn't just a way to give back. It was a way to honor the legacy of someone who had changed his life forever. The shelter was busier than usual, and as Kevin helped to serve food and listen to the stories of others, he found himself sharing his own. Not out of pride, but out of a desire to let others know that change was possible, that even the darkest days could lead to brighter ones. And in the quiet moments, when the noise of the world faded away, Kevin would think back to that afternoon at the café. He would remember the calm presence of Clint Eastwood, the kindness that had seemed so foreign, yet so necessary. He would remember the lesson that had forever altered the course of his life. And he would smile, knowing that sometimes the greatest gift wasn't a handout. It was someone simply believing that you were worth the fight. With the light of a new opportunity flashing in Kevin's eyes, he realized that life doesn't always end when we think it does. Thanks to Clint's honesty and advice, Kevin found a new direction, not through easy solutions, but through believing in himself. This encounter opened the next chapter in his life. And what about your story? Share with us your feelings about life-changing moments, and don't forget to follow us to discover other stories. See you in our next stories.